From the Commonwealth Club of California, this is Climate One, changing the conversation about America's energy, economy, and environment. I'm Greg Dalton, and last night I had a glass of wine with dinner. Well, two actually. In California, wine bottles and stores carry signs that say drinking alcohol may increase cancer risks. Does that mean that Americans who drink and I are in denial about alcohol and cancer? On the show today, we will discuss many forms of denial, from a little bit won't hurt me to burning fossil fuels isn't warming the earth. Experts say some denial is human, normal, and necessary. It also can be manufactured and dangerous. Here at Climate One, we often come at questions from different disciplines and perspectives, and today on the show, we'll hear from a scientist, a journalist, a psychologist, and an editorial cartoonist. Along the way, we'll include questions from our live audience here at the Commonwealth Club in San Francisco, which includes people living in denial about many, many things. Michael Mann is, I can tell, just looking. Michael Mann is Distinguished Professor of Meteorology at Penn State University. He is co-author of the new book, The Madhouse Effect: How Climate Change Denial is Threatening Our Planet, Destroying Our Politics, and Driving Us Crazy. Renee Lertzman is an author and speaker who focuses on the psychological aspects of climate and the environment. She's the author of Environmental Melancholia: Psychoanalytic Dimensions of Engagement. Christine Russell is a veteran science journalist. Her writing has appeared in Columbia Journalism Review, Scientific American, The Atlantic, and The Washington Post. She's a senior fellow at Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government. Tom Towles is the editorial cartoonist from The Washington Post and author of the Tom Towles blog. He's won many awards, including the Pulitzer Prize for editorial cartooning. With Michael Mann, he is co-author of The Madhouse Effect. Please welcome them to Climate One. Welcome to all of you. I want to begin by playing a clip. We went out and found a climate denier. We figured we wouldn't have a whole lot of them, that perspective, on stage in the audience today, so we wanted to be sure that that was heard. So we went out to a grocery store in Richmond, California, and we found David Ehrlich, who is a chair of the Republican Party in Alameda County. Let's hear what David Ehrlich has to say.
My name is David Ehrlich. I'm from Los Angeles, California, but I currently live in San Leandro. I'm an electrician by trade, and I am the current chairman of the Alameda County Republican Party. The first political moment I remember in my life was my parents screaming at the TV at Jimmy Carter. And then I also remember selling lemonade in the odd-even lines for gas. We lived about a half a mile from a gas station that the line went right past our house. When I was in junior high school, the big thing is we're all going to freeze to death because there's a hole in the ozone layer. We can't use aerosol sprays anymore. I remember my mom was a big hair gal in the 80s, and she liked her hairspray, and she thought it was going to be taken away. And so I was like, as a kid, even in science class, I would ask the science teacher, what's the hole? Is it like sucking everything out? How does it work? And it never really could be explained to me how the hole in the ozone layer, that seems to be forgotten about. We've gone from it's going to freeze us all to death to global warming to now it's climate change. Carbon tax is being implemented because of it. It's not right. It's not right. So low voltage. So this is only 12 volts going through here. They're being strapped up because the LEDs only use 12 volts. I'm not saying that there isn't climate change. There is climate change, because if you go with the definition of climate change, the climate has changed from this morning to this evening. It depends on what scale you want to look at it at. If we're looking at coming out of the ice age and now we're warming, that's where we're at. So that would be a natural progression. I don't really believe there's 99% of the scientists, and what class of scientists. Most of the meteorologists I know don't subscribe to the type of global warming that we've been told we're involved in. Those are LEDs, these little ones that I put up. There's more LEDs going up. So the guy's going to spend a third less and get twice as much lighting on it. We need to be working on alternative energies, period, because not just because of any damage we can do to the climate or any damage we can do to the earth or change the climate, because it's economically right, it's advancement. Really, what we're looking at is economics, because we're looking at a financial disaster that'll do us in quicker than any global warming at this point in time.
That's David Ehrlich, electrician, who we talked to in Richmond, California. He's chair of the Alameda County Republican Party. And we sent the journalist Andrew Stelzer out there to talk to him. Michael Mann, there's a lot in there. Unpack some of that, first of all, climate and weather is a difference there. But how do you respond to his views, which represent a lot of what we hear in the climate debate?
Yeah. How long do we have here? Well, I think it's easy to vilify somebody like that. It would be easy for us to laugh at some of the ignorance that is betrayed in that segment. But to me, he's an example of someone who's really a victim. He's not the enemy. He's a victim of a massive misinformation campaign that we're fighting constantly when it comes to the science of climate change. And you can hear that in the litany of talking points, because he's essentially delivering standard sort of climate change, contrarian climate change denial talking points. He got some of them mixed up. Of course, the ozone layer, it's a completely different issue from climate change. And no, scientists weren't talking about cooling in the 1970s. There were some scientists who looked at the competing nature of particulates that were cooling the planet because of dirty coal burning and greenhouse gases, and these two effects were pushing the climate in different directions. Well, we passed the Clean Air Acts in the 1970s to take those particles out of industrial emissions, and of course that unmasked the hidden warming that has emerged in the time since then. So I think what's also important to understand, just in the logical progression, is that those talking points were really just a way to justify an ideological position. And in the end, you saw where he was coming from. There's a quote that I love attributed to James Inhofe, a very well-known Senate climate change denier from Oklahoma. And he once said something to this effect. He said, "I used to believe the science of climate change until I learned how much it would cost." And I think that statement really betrays sort of the underlying mental process that's at work, and I'm sure Renee can shed some additional light on that. So I think it's important to understand that in the end, this person comes out on the right side of the issue, and maybe there's some internal conflict. Maybe he ultimately understands that there is a problem here. He doesn't want to explicitly mention it because, climate change is sort of, for the tribe that he belongs to, it's ideologically inappropriate to concede that climate change is real. But in his heart, he sort of knows that it is, and he knows the right thing is to move in the direction of clean energy, and he's actually helping in that effort. So,
Renee Lertzman, I made the question of whether the science is even relevant. He's installing LED lights, right? Who cares what he thinks about the science, right? Yeah. He's installing clean energy. Science is complicated, it's abstract. Yeah. Do we focus too much on the science, and is it more emotional things that people respond to?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that example illustrates how incredibly complicated this is, but more so that as humans we're capable of tolerating and managing a lot of contradictions in ourselves and in one another. So yeah, I mean, what I'm reminded of in seeing that clip and in Mike's comments is when we're confronted with information that brings up conflict with our beliefs, our worldview, our ideology, whatever, our mind will actually generate incredible strategies to deny, repress, and basically avoid our engagement with the situation and with the reality. That's just neurologically, from a neuroscientific perspective, that's what our minds do. When conflict is introduced, our neural networks are activated, and we actually do seek out scenarios that help us stay in alignment with a worldview. And I would add that I think the reason why the messages and the discourse have efficacy and land with people is precisely because there's a incredible difficulty in coming to terms with what's happening. So, I'm also reminded in interviews I've done with Republicans around climate change, hardcore skeptics, that we see exactly what we're talking about, and what Mike was mentioning is a lot of vacillation between a recognition and acknowledgement. Somehow you kind of know that they know deep down that something's up, but they can't allow themselves to go there because of my identity, affiliation. It doesn't feel safe or acceptable to do that. Our job is to try to make it more safe, to make it to give one another permission to actually go there.
Christine Russell, has the media done a good job doing that?
Well, first of all, the media is a plural word, and so I think I've seen a number of nostalgia pieces recently. Remember the good old days of Walter Cronkite, where that's the way it is. And I think people, particularly in this post-election period, are really realizing that, again, a lot of the polarization and the kind of thoughts that we were hearing in that view of the climate denier is because people are getting their information from so many different sources. And so one of our problems, if you're in mainstream news media, is getting people the information. And people are still getting a lot of information from television, but they're also getting it from selected sources of information that reinforce what they think to start with. And so we don't have that collective wisdom. And I think one of the challenges for science, for journalism, for any field is how do you get a better, more educated audience on some of these areas of science? And back to the point you made, I don't think people have to be scientists. And looking at the conversation he was having as the electrician about his beliefs as if somehow he could sort out the science. And so we've lost some trust, and I think the news media has also lost a certain amount of trust, and people are blaming the media, and certainly in this election campaign, particularly on the Republican side, the media is as much a target as everybody else. And so we, I think, in the news media, in mainstream journalism, really have a challenge to try to reach out in a bigger pond and reach other people than just preaching to the converted. So I think we really have a challenge, and I think we're going to have a lot to cover in the coming months, that's for sure.
We're going to go to our other member of the news media in just a minute, Tom Tolles. First, I want to show you another clip in a recent episode of National Geographic's climate change program, The Years of Living Dangerously. Jack Black talks to a psychiatrist, Lisa Van Susteren. Jack Black is sitting on a beach, laying back, and there's a psychiatrist sitting in a chair with a pencil and a pad next to him. So here's Jack Black talking about climate change.
What we know is coming is sea level rise. 3 feet, 6 feet, 12 feet. What is it that keeps me from really believing or wrapping my head around these facts?
Here's your premise that's wrong. You are thinking that our brains are only rational, and they're not. Our brains are wired in part to deny unpleasant emotions. There is a part of our brain which is highly rational, analyzes data, takes in information, and then there's the emotional part of the brain. And the emotional part of the brain is extremely powerful.
And it feels more comfortable just to shut down the scientific part of my brain and just enjoy the right now.
That's Jack Black in Years of Living Dangerously talking to the psychiatrist Lisa Van Susteren. Tom Tolles, humor gets to a deeper level, perhaps get to that emotional level. So how do you approach climate change in the cartoons that you've done in the book?
Well, my answer will fold back into some of the previous video too. I mean, we were just talking about, has the news media been helpful in this? And I would say that over the last 30 years on this topic, and I agree the media is a plural, but I think over the last 30 years, the media has been, in the aggregate, essentially abysmal at covering the climate issue, both in terms of the way they defaulted into the easy formula of both sides. That's one problem. The other problem is not taking the enormity of the problem seriously at all and relegating it as kind of a side issue, page 6 issue, when it's, I was on a radio program earlier this morning, and I said, the analogy, I mean, cartoonists think in visual terms, but the analogy is this is an asteroid coming at Earth, and everybody says, oh, well, what if an asteroid hits us someday? This is essentially the same thing. The science of the matter is very clear now. We can see that asteroid growing in the sky every day, and we're confronted with a news media that for some reason doesn't care to cover the story of the asteroid that's going to hit us particularly. And when they do cover it, have covered it. It's getting a little better now, but they've covered it, well, we're gonna talk to a scientist that explains that the asteroid is this size, and when it hits the Earth in this place, it's going to do this amount of damage. You can measure and calculate this, and then we're going to talk to an electrician who works for the Republican Party, and ask him if he thinks that the asteroid is there, or whether it's similar or different to other asteroids that may or may not have been there, or rumors of asteroids, or mythological animals. I mean, I find I think it's an excellent place to start a discussion, but I think it's actually a little bit offensive that this electrician is given even that much time. I agree. Actually, my real answer is to listen to the answers that were given before, because Michael's answer was perfect. This individual as a human being is not the enemy, and I agree with everything he said about it, but in practicality, actually, yes, he is the enemy. And the enemy is also taking this guy's completely incoherent understanding of the issue as representing something other than a massive problem. I mean, I just hope to God that he understands how to wire a house better than he understands what he was saying about his understanding, because it didn't even add up to anything. I mean, if you wired a house the way he was talking, the whole thing would burn down in a day. And I would say, not only don't hire this guy to install your wiring, I would say also don't join any political parties that this guy is associated with.
Right.
But anyway, what was the question?
Renee Lertzman, in all fairness, that gentleman who spoke to our reporter isn't here to defend himself, and it may get laughs, but is it right to villainize people like that?
Right. So, no, I think we're all in agreement on that point. I just want to follow on Tom's comment about the asteroid. So I will actually clarify the difference between an asteroid and climate change is that an asteroid is external to us, and climate change, we're all living within the systems that are producing the issue, and that is what makes it fundamentally a profound psychological and social quandary and dilemma, because we will, as humans, deny and defend till the bitter end if we feel that, and one of the things that came up in the video is loss. So his mother was afraid that something that she's attached to is going to be taken away. That's going on at a collective social level. And I think humor is one of our most powerful resources for effectively disarming the human defense mechanisms. I mean, Freud knew this, many psychotherapists know this, that humor can be very disarming, in addition to other mechanisms, other strategies that help disarm, and that includes the ability to say, look, this is scary, maybe feels overwhelming, I don't want this to be true as well. So show some empathy. I mean, God knows I wish this wasn't true. But it is, and that's why we all, so you move on from there.
We're all part of it. As you're just joining us, Renee Lertzman is an author and environmental psychologist. Michael Mann is a professor of meteorology at Penn State University. Christine Russell is a veteran science journalist, a fellow at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, and Tom Tolles, the editorial cartoonist at the Washington Post. I'm Greg Dalton. Mike Mann, I'd like to ask you about a real legitimate villain, perhaps. Frederick Seitz was former president of the National Academy of Sciences, president of Rockefeller University, won many awards, and he, you write in your book, The Madhouse Effect, is a founding figure in the art of modern-day science denialism. So tell us how such a distinguished figure went to the dark side.
Yeah, I have some personal connections with Seitz in a sense. He was a solid earth physicist, a very distinguished, not a solid earth, a solid state physicist.
Flat Earth, but
so studying how materials work, and that's where I got my start in physics as well at UC Berkeley. I was studying in that area. And ultimately, he became president of the Rockefeller Institute, a member of the National Academy of Sciences. He actually became president of the National Academy of Sciences. So when people say, how is it that somebody that smart cannot get the science of climate change? It's not a matter of intelligence. I think we have to recognize that. There are ideological issues at work, and in his case, he actually ended up receiving, I think, something like $70 million from R.J. Reynolds Tobacco to found an institute whose primary function would be to attack the science linking tobacco and human health. And there's a famous saying attributed to Upton Sinclair. It's very difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on not understanding it. And so I think we have to recognize that there is denialism that comes from exactly the place that Renee is describing. There are various strains of denialism. Some of it comes from a self-interested sort of origin as well. I think in some sense that's the more challenging denialism to access and maybe convert and turn around because it's so self-interested and it's so tied to ideology. I don't think any amount of information was going to convince a former president of the National Academy of Sciences, that he was wrong about this science. I think he was absolutely convinced that he was right, and he was convinced that he was doing the right thing from a political standpoint. I think that's a harder nut to crack. I think it's part of what we face, the fact that climate change denialism, that people like the electrician that we're talking about, as I said before, I see him as a victim of a campaign, a massive disinformation campaign. The same interests, some of the same talking heads who were working for the tobacco industry decades ago, denying the connection between tobacco and climate change, are today receiving money from fossil fuel interests to undermine the public's understanding and policymakers' understanding of the science of climate change. And that is, well, suffice it to say that those people, to some extent, were operating in the shadows. Given the latest round of nominations for various departments in our presidency, those people may now be controlling the reins of government, and that's something we haven't seen before.
Tom Tolles, you're going to have a lot of fun the next 4 years.
Only if you find describing the imminent decline and destruction of the planet, the ecosystems, the economic base, the political base, and pretty much everything that we've come to depend on and love about the planet and our way of life and our fellow man. If you can enjoy the process of watching the dissolution and destruction of all of that, I'd be having a great time. I agree with Renee, and I mean, climate has been described as the political policy problem from hell, and the recent research on the way the brain functions, the way it has evolved as a many tracking system, some of the tracks are rational, some are instinctual, some of them are selfish, some of them are social. That is the fundamental base on which this issue has fallen, in that it's abstract It asks for sacrifices now for a vague threat later. And all of that is true. This is not the first time this has happened. I mean, almost every environmental issue has played into this a psychological trap to a certain extent. I think the electrician's referencing to the ozone hole was probably the most directly applicable, although he didn't seem to understand the difference between that and the climate issue. But there again, it was aerosols are going to do something. We have to change the product that we're familiar with, comfortable with, economically secure with, to fix a problem that is described as molecular interaction that is destroying something a layer that no one had ever heard of before that was going to cause cancer. That was also a problem very much like this, only on some ways a smaller scale, although that was also globally a fairly significant one. But the fact of the matter is we did solve it. Human beings can solve this. The climate problem is the same psychological problem. I'm sorry for going on just a little long. I'll finish in a second. The psychological problem is there, but you take away the specific, directed, focused, targeted misinformation campaign from the fossil fuel industry, this problem would look entirely different. The public opinion, even the opinion within the Republican Party, and I use that as a generic, not necessarily always in every case, every Republican, but even the positions and policies within the Republican Party were starting to come around. That has changed. The science has only gotten stronger. It's the money that is contaminating this problem, and now that all that has flowed into an overt political machine that is occupying the American government right now.
Tom Towles is the editorial cartoonist for The Washington Post. We're talking about climate denial at Climate One. I'm Greg Dalton. I'd like to go to our lightning round, which is a series of quick questions and quick answers for our guest today. This is a word association. I'll mention a noun and ask you to just mention the first thing that pops into your head. Starting with Tom Towles, Rex Tillerson.
George Orwell's 1984.
Mike Mann, the late climate scientist Stephen Schneider.
A ray of hope.
Chris Russell, economist Bjorn Lomborg.
Denial.
Renee Lertzman, Donald Trump.
Narcissist.
This is a yes or no, true or false question for Mike Mann. A primary reason Americans haven't taken more action on climate change is they lack the basic facts about burning fossil fuels.
No.
Renee Lertzman, true or false? Facts change people's minds.
False.
Tom Towles, yes or no? Many Americans want to revisit high school science.
No.
Chris Russell, yes or no? Talking about science makes the climate conversation unnecessarily complicated and boring.
Yes.
Mike Mann, yes or no? You have climate deniers in your family.
No.
Chris Russell, yes or no? The intel on human-caused climate change isn't 100%.
Ooh, that's a very hard one. It's virtually. I guess this was yes or no, right?
Yes or no?
Oh. I guess no.
Tom Towles, yes or no? Tragedy is hilarious.
That's a quote from me. So
I ripped it off his blog.
I wrote it, yes.
And actually...
But you got it from someone else.
And actually, Tom has a cartoon on that number where the cartoon says it's 100% of scientists, and then there's a correction on the news. No, it's 99.5%, and the person at home said, aha, something's wrong. So I had to think through that cartoon.
It's in the book. It's in the book.
The Madhouse Effect. Renee Lertzman, yes or no? one of the most primitive defenses is villainization.
Yes.
Also for Renee Lertzman, villainization is going to be the ultimate downfall of the climate movement.
Yes.
This is for Tom Tolles. Yes or no? Walter White would be an excellent choice to run the Drug Enforcement Agency.
I'm not even going to answer.
That's Saturday Night Live last week. Chris Russell, yes or no? Donald Trump is stepping away from making his businesses bankrupt to bankrupt the country.
Yes.
Got that from Andy Borowitz in The New Yorker. Last one, Renee Lertzman. Kellyanne Conway told Fox News that while Trump could bankrupt his companies in the country at the same time, he owes it to the American people to put them first.
How do you answer that?
That's Andy Borowitz, also from The New Yorker. Thank you. Let's give our round to these guests at Climate One. Renee Lertzman, I want to ask you about James Inhofe, because sometimes people, facts, you said, don't change people's minds. James Inhofe, the Republican senator from Oklahoma, canceled a keynote address a few years ago at the Heartland Institute, an institute that denies climate change is happening. He dove into a lake, Grand Lake in Oklahoma, for a routine swim, and there was an algae bloom, and he was deathly sick. And his 13-year-old granddaughter didn't want to go into that green stuff. And speaking to humor, Senator Inhofe said to a local paper that the environment strikes back. So tell us about the power of personal influence, personal experience, and perhaps children getting to deniers as a way of changing their views.
Can I just interject very briefly? That algal bloom was a result of the unprecedented heat and drought that Oklahoma was experiencing at the time.
And we now have an EPA administrator from Oklahoma. It'll be interesting to see how
Well, we don't have him yet.
Okay.
Nominated.
That's very important.
Okay. So Renee Lertzman, what I'm trying to get at is personal experience, loved ones, changing people's minds that have not otherwise been changed by facts.
Right. So, yes, there's enough evidence and research that supports the fact that when we have direct experience of issues, that influences our perceptions, but we want to be very careful that we don't go too far in that end of the spectrum. So going back to the point around our psychological challenges around engaging with these issues, we do have imaginations. We do have capacity to engage with our imagination, but having that direct visceral experience can support that, but it's not the full story. So Kari Norgaard's work, and I know Kari has been on the stage as well talking about her research in Norway, her book Living in Denial, explores how people living in a village where snow was literally not there, people were still in profound denial. So even when things are right in front of us, waters are rising, homes in Calgary are being flooded, people can still absolutely be in denial of what is happening. The point that you mentioned around the influence of children is also becoming more recognized as very powerful. So one organization, the Alliance for Climate Education, that I've been working with actually is focusing on supporting young people to have more effective conversations with their parents. We're going to be studying that, doing research with some folks over at Stanford. So we will be able to see how the conversations that young people, especially teens, are having with their parents and how that might introduce some openings. And this also relates to the point around conversation, that when we're in social interactions with people we trust and care about, that is absolutely where we can start to see openings in how we, the fixation on the denial.
A lot of people hoping that Ivanka Trump can get to her dad. Chris Russell.
Well, no, I was going to say, in the smoking, I covered a lot of the smoking wars and the financial influence, but also during that era, there were good studies showing that kids who had learned in school about smoking came home and did have an impact on their parents, and wisely so, given secondhand smoke as it turned out to be. So I think this anecdotal approach, it's also used in journalism quite a bit, the anecdotal lead where you tell the story of what has happened to someone. And it can go either way. And perhaps one of the stronger ways to get public interest in the issue of the seriousness of the issue is to have more stories coming from places where people are being impacted. And I think one of the surprises, in a way, is the evidence that is happening all around us, as opposed to there'll be more to come, obviously, but I think telling more stories about how it's impacting and then bringing the science in to explain how that might be related or precursor and such has always been an effective way, I think, giving people, and it doesn't happen in journalism, it's always a challenge as a science journalist, figure out how to get the science out in a kind of easy dose and not cough medicine. So
I want to look forward, because one of the criticisms of science and journalism is that it's always doom and gloom, it's all the bad stuff, and people want stories of hope, they want what can I do? And Chris Russell, a lot of the journalism around climate is melting glaciers, droughts, bad stuff happening. And is that because good stories don't make, good news stories don't get on page one? Is it because they don't have some tension, or journalists are predisposed to talk about planes crashing, not planes that land safely, sure, but where is the positive stories?
Well, I think the things connecting the dots is the energy picture is obviously the bigger story. What can we do, even as that electrician that we're going to keep thinking about? You can do something about a problem regardless of whether you know all of the details. And so most of the surveys that are being done show considerable public support for renewable energy, for actually paying more to get cars that run on more efficient fuel. So I think that energy and technology, if it's not exaggerated, provides a kind of counterpoint, and also the speed with which, particularly all around the world, renewable energy is growing, gives people something to do, because I think it's definitely true. Particularly, we've got to stay away from the stories that the ice is up, the ice is down, and try to have more context in these stories. But I think more coverage and getting the business and energy reporters to also bring in the science and explain how this more efficient car, or electric car, I guess, which gets to go across the bridge for free here, how that connects to doing something about the environment and about climate change.
Mike Mann?
Yeah, I was just going to say that that sort of the ice is up, the ice is down. Andy Revkin refers to that as the whiplash effect. These seemingly contradictory stories that people hear that causes confusion and doubt and potentially denial. I wanted to actually poll the audience, if I may. Who here read this story, which appeared over the last few days? We have now seen the third year in a row where global carbon emissions did not increase, even as the global economy continued to increase.
Yeah. So
this is an informed audience.
Yeah, a quarter of the audience.
Yeah, and that should be leading page one, as far as I'm concerned.
But at the same time, there was also the story about methane going up. So, there's the counterpoint.
The whiplash effect.
Renee Lertzman, facts are confusing. Facts haven't changed. This mountain of facts haven't caused us to do the thing that we need to do. Can we just put science and facts aside and deal with something else, as Jack Black wants to do on the couch on the beach?
No, absolutely not. But what we really have to do is take a more integrated approach that recognizes that fact and reason and rationality have to be integrated with the emotional reality. I think in the focus on solutions and positive stories, we want to be very careful that that's not actually sufficient. It's sort of like what's called bypassing. When you just focus on the kind of rah-rah, here's the good story, you're not actually addressing the other part of the story and the experience, that this is a little overwhelming, it's a little scary, this is a little confusing. And I think if we do more experimentation in our communications, and this is a place of innovation, we're all being kind of forced to do things differently right now, to experiment with addressing the reality and the facts and the solutions, but bring in a little bit of that emotional intelligence, bring in a little bit of that, this is kind of hard or whatever that is, and then move into and look what's happening now. And I think we'll see a much greater level of receptivity and engagement in the issues if we take that more kind of an integrated angle.
We're talking about climate change and denial at Climate One. That's Renee Lertzman, author and strategist. We did a poll on Twitter. We had 850 votes, and we asked the question, what do you think about human-caused climate change? 61% said it's real and will impact me. 11% said it's real and won't impact me. 12% said it's natural, and 16% said it's a hoax. So I want to get to this, it's real and won't impact me, because Renee Lertzman, that's a form of climate denial light. We're talking here about denial, which is it's not happening, and we hear about that. But there's another thing, which is it's happening, but it's going to hurt people far away, or polar bears, or people on Pacific Islands. It's not going to affect me on a hill somewhere where I'll be safe from sea level rise.
Right.
I call this the kinder, gentler climate change denial.
Right, exactly. Yeah, Mike's written about the kind of these variations as well. So there's some nice research out there around these variations. You can think of it as rationalization, distantiation, where you're actually putting space or distance between yourself and the issue. These are all very well-known, documented strategies that we engage in that, as you say, are not cut and dry denial. There's also disavowal, where you're not denying something exists, but you're choosing to not actually live in that awareness. You're choosing to go on business as usual. It's not the same as saying it doesn't exist. So these, again, are sort of well-known, well-crafted strategies. And as Kari Norgaard has written about, and Mike in your book, that we need one another to actually corroborate, to make it real. So it's not just me as an individual going around having this thought. I need people in my life, and I need social interactions who can mirror and reflect that back.
Mike Mann, you write in your book with Tom Tolles about Ken Cuccinelli, who was an official and ran for governor in Virginia, and he basically started legal action against you to get emails regarding some grants when you taught at the University of Virginia. University of Virginia paid $350,000 in legal fees defending you and others. Tell us what he's doing now, Ken Cuccinelli, former Attorney General of Virginia.
Yeah, well, I call him the Cooch, because that's, to those close to him, he's known as the Cooch. Since...
Is that what you always call him?
I'm trying to think, and I
no
think
answer needed.
every instance I can think of. So he was ultimately not victorious. His civil subpoena was defeated, was rejected by the state Supreme Court. Undaunted, he ran for governor of California in the last election. Governor of Virginia. Governor of Virginia. I'm promoting him all of a sudden. Governor of Virginia, I campaigned actively with his opponent, Terry McAuliffe, who was victorious. Ken Cuccinelli, in defeat, went off to work on an oyster farm on Tangier Island, which is a small island in the Chesapeake Bay, which is slowly succumbing to the effects of global sea level rise. Now, Google it. It's true. You can't make this stuff up. Climate change, there really is no greater hypocrisy, in my view, than the hypocrisy we see, climate change denial.
People often think that they'll get out in time. They'll see it coming, they can get out in time. I want to ask Tom Tolles about one of his cartoons that's in the book, Madhouse Effect in the Washington Post. It's a villain in court testifying. It's this big, ugly monster, and he's in court. And he says, maybe that storm was one of mine, maybe it wasn't. You can't prove a thing, so you'll just have to let me go.
Yeah, I mean, one of the games, there have been many games played in the debate over climate change, and one of the games that the denial community has played is they take a fact from the science side that you cannot specifically attribute any one event to climate change. it could have been it could have happened anyway, which is true. And it's just a cynical game of tangle-footing your opposition with their own honesty. And so they always deploy that against the news media in particular, any linkage whatsoever. And I've dealt with this in my cartoons, because the cartoonist, I'm trying to convey visually and viscerally what climate change will be like. And you see a freak storm, a catastrophic flood, a fire. You want to take all those visuals and deploy those and say, okay, maybe even if this one wasn't connected to, can't be proven to be connected to climate change data, this is what the future is going to be like. But you have to do that maneuver, that even if, then also kind of thing, which is, well, it's a little, it's a trickier argument to make. So the cartoon was directed at explaining the specific tactic of trying to split those two things apart. Before the conversation gets away from this, and I know I'm stepping outside the question you've asked, I think Renee has gotten the psychology of this exactly right. I just want to push back on that a little bit, which I did already once, and I'm going to repeat it a little bit. The psychology is very real. It's not simply a psychological problem. You take away the industry funding on the specific targeted, politically directed action that this money is being used for, the psychology of the politics would be better. Wouldn't necessarily be fundamentally different, but it would be, the politics would look a lot different. And a lot of the progress that we've been making, both in terms of public education, both in terms of international policy, national policy under the Obama administration, we have in this last election crossed over into an extraordinarily hazardous moment where all the gains are at risk. I don't think they're lost. But politically, this is an extraordinarily hazardous time that I don't think we've even yet realized. This is a dangerous time for climate and a whole lot of other things too. But we are out of screwing around time. There's no time left. And it sounds like I'm arguing with Renee. I'm not. She's right. You've got to solve the psychological problem to solve the political problem, but the political problem has just leapt way ahead of the psychology here, and we are now in a horrible place. And I don't want anybody to leave here to think that, oh, this is just an interesting conversation that we've had, a lot of good thoughts. This is genuinely, permanently dangerous, not just to the planet, not just to the climate, but all our politics, our government institutions, our economy, they're all floating like a institution on thin ice that's melting from under us. You can see what refugees do to politics in Europe, how it can help undermine all the democratic institutions. These are not just abstract questions, and they're not in the future anymore. We are right up against it now, and if you don't walk away with anything else from that, just remember that we are right at the edge of the precipice right now, and we're teetering.
Tom Tolles is the editorial cartoonist from the Washington Post. We'll have Christine Russell quickly, and then we'll go to audience questions.
I also just want to respond.
Sure, okay. Chris Russell first, and then.
I was just going to say that going forward, as was said earlier, a lot of this denial has come out of the shadows, where you have headlines saying the nominee for the EPA is a climate denier. So I think one of the really important things going forward is the fact that I think the news media is going to toughen up in terms of following the history and digging down to hear more about their history, where their funding came from, and more investigative reporting on that front. The follow the money, follow the history, I think will be being done on all fronts, not just by journalists, but I think there's going to be an opportunity to make it very public because the announcements are very public. And so I think people will have a better idea of who these candidates are. And certainly we're getting mixed signals from Donald Trump, but the nominees say his intentions. So.
Fair. Renee Lertzman, Tom Towles painted a very dark picture. What do people do with that fear? That's sort of a dark, is that a mobilizing place? People know that, but they don't know what to do with it or where to go with it.
Exactly. I mean, it's a terrifying, paralyzing, potentially paralyzing place. Trauma does tend to fight, flight, or freeze us. I just want to clarify that I'm in complete agreement with your prognosis and your position. Where I'm coming from, I recognize the enormous machinery that's, in motion here. What I think we have to really attend to urgently is to find ways to support one another in resisting that, the mechanisms that you've described so acutely, right? So I just want to make that very clear. I'm not at all saying there is not a huge, massive, scary political context we're in, but unless we actually bring in some psychological insight into how we can support ourselves and one another in moving through the paralysis and through the denial, we are really going to be in, even more danger.
People don't know what to do about it. We're talking about climate denial at Climate One. You just heard Renee Lertzman, an author and strategist with a psychological background. Michael Mann is a professor of meteorology at Penn State University. Christine Russell is a veteran science journalist and fellow at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. And Tom Towles, the Pulitzer Prize-winning editorial cartoonist for The Washington Post. We're going to invite your participation in the 11 minutes we have left. We're going to make these questions quick and brisk and get in as many as we can. And we have a stampede.
We'll keep our answers short.
Yeah.
Which is great. To get through, and some people are making a dash. So what we'll actually do is we'll pair up. We'll take 2 questions at a time at the microphone. Microphone back there. The questions are line forming. We're not going to get through the whole line, I'll tell you that. Let's go to questions. We'll take 2 at a time. Yes, first question, please.
Willful blindness is a legal theory that's employed in the drug industry. Do you all see any connection where it could be used in this fight against climate change?
Thank you. Willful blindness, and we'll take the second question.
Very, very much appreciate the panel, and it takes a cartoonist to get us serious. Thank you. What kind of climate event will finally wake us up so that we do not squander any more time, because we have no time left to squander?
Thank you. Willful blindness, Mike Mann.
I think that argument has been made. I think that was used against the tobacco industry in the legislation, in the court case that was brought by the state's attorneys general, that they knowingly hid information of about the adverse impact of their product. The same argument today is being made actually by the same lead attorney from the tobacco wars, is now making the argument that ExxonMobil, for example, may have engaged in exactly the same behavior.
Second question is, what event will finally mobilize? We saw Superstorm Sandy, Hurricane Katrina, all these incremental things. What's going to tip the balance? Who'd like to take that one?
Tom
Towles.
I'll take we've had massive fires. We've had flooding from tornadoes. We've had, from hurricanes. We've had tornadoes. We've had flooding from just freak rainstorms. Michael on the radio program this morning mentioned that for ordinary pollution, when the Cuyahoga River caught fire, that was the flood. That was the event that triggered the public understanding of the issue. I have my own theory: is fires weren't enough, flooding wasn't enough, hurricanes, tornadoes weren't enough. The environmental event that's going to change the understanding of this issue is when people come out of their houses and march on Washington and march on fossil fuel companies. It's going to be a tidal wave of human beings. That's what it takes right now. Everybody's going to have to get out of their chairs and do something.
Some people would say food scarcity, seeing it in the aisles of the grocery stores might affect. Let's go. We'll take 2 questions at a time. Welcome to Climate One.
Before the election, there was a great piece in The Atlantic titled Donald Trump is the first demagogue of the Anthropocene. Its premise was that we would have expected conditions for the election of a demagogue to have emerged looking at the climate data, but maybe not till 2050. So everything's happening faster. It's here now. And my question is to contrast that with the need to get over things like having villains. You know, how do we confront this sort of the urgency of things happening faster and not being in denial about that with needing to attend to sort of changing some of the dynamics socially about how we understand villains or these qualities of humanity we need to kind of rise to the occasion?
Thank you. And then second question.
Real quick for everybody, when did you start thinking climate change was an issue? Sort of how did that happen? And did you come from a skeptical or just not thinking about it viewpoint beforehand?
Personal epiphany or moment, realization. Who'd like to take that one?
Well, for me, I'll answer very quickly. I read early on, 30 years ago, I read the stories. They said, okay, maybe it isn't proven. If it's true, it's catastrophe. Steps now can be taken. For me, it was one of the problems where the downside risk was a different order of magnitude than most problems, even if the science wasn't right. I started drawing about it then. I continued to draw about it because the rest of the media was not taking that seriously. I was just sort of trying to add an additional voice that didn't seem to be there.
Renee Lertzman, the previous question was this urgency. We need to change quickly, and yet we need to change things that seem to change slowly, like our consciousness and these systems happen slowly, but we got to go fast. How do we handle that?
Well, humans can change and respond to events incredibly quickly. It happens in behavior change and in personal kind of psychological situations all the time. The most expedient, fast way to accelerate change is by disarming our defenses, by acknowledging what's actually going on and making it safe to go there. So the more that we can train and support people who are in situations where we can actually have different kinds of conversations that have to do with recognizing that we're all in this and that no one intended for this to happen. So in other words, the biggest barrier to our engaging with climate change are precisely those issues of conflict, guilt, shame, confusion, and I'm not talking about from the industry,
Mike Mann.
Yeah, so to complement that, I think that's important, but we know that market forces are extremely powerful in directing human behavior, and the bottom line, a price on carbon would absolutely help move us in the right direction.
Let's go to our next audience question. Welcome to Climate One.
August 2008, Scientific American magazine stated that the effect of global warming can be controlled. Then it goes on to state, if you overlay uncontrolled population rise, there is no hope. You have not at all addressed that. Why not?
Thank you. Population question. We'll take one more. Why not population? Thank you. Next question.
To address the villainization part, I remember reading a piece, I think it was the New York Times, maybe it was the New Yorker, about basically the way the Italian head, whether he's prime minister or premier, stayed in power because people concentrated on personal attacks rather than the policies that he was implementing. And so I'd like to know whether people think that is accurate, sort of from a psychological standpoint, and if so, how do we shift the conversation from, Trump is the next Hitler, Trump is the next whatever, and all his appointees are whatever, to these are bad things that they're doing?
Thank you. Mike Mann, environmentalists, climate people don't like to talk about population.
Yeah, that's, well, Well, you know, our good friend Paul Ehrlich was talking about population some time ago, and there's an identity that we often refer to when we talk about carbon emissions. It's called the Kaya identity. Bill Gates, a couple years ago, took credit for it, having claimed to discover it himself, but it's actually been around for more than a decade. And it's a simple sort of mathematical expression that tells us how much carbon builds up in the atmosphere. Well, it's a product of how many people there are burning carbon. It's a product of how we are getting our energy. And there are a number of terms, but the first term in the Kaya identity is population. So all other things being equal, more people on the face of the planet using more energy, energy that is gained from the burning of carbon, are going to produce more carbon emissions. Now, where that becomes problematic is that not all people are equal when it comes to carbon emissions. And for example, in China, China has the largest aggregate carbon emissions of any country on the planet, but their per capita emissions are still substantially lower than ours. Now the worry is, as China industrializes their economy further, as India industrializes their economy, as the rest of the world leads a more Western-style lifestyle, and their carbon footprints start to increase, that's really the problem. That's the problem we face. It isn't so much right now how many people there are, it's how many people who are burning carbon to get energy.
Living like us. Renee Lertzman, there was another part of that question, which was basically, could villainizing, I think they're referring to perhaps former Berlusconi, former Prime Minister of Italy, who was a billionaire, stayed in power despite lots of scandals a long time. Can villainization, we remember that in reality TV, the villain is the star. We have a reality TV star who's now soon president of the United States. Could villainizing him make him stronger and more popular?
Without question. I mean, it's a siphoning of enormous amounts of energy and attention. Villains, characters suck up all the oxygen in the room and distract us from dealing with what's actually going on, which is why we have to talk about anxiety. We have to talk about the conditions that give rise to someone like him coming into power.
Let's go to our last two questions. Yes.
Dr. Mann, when you first published the Climate Wars and Hockey Stick, in the first few hours of the reviews on Amazon, there was an enormous number of reviews that suddenly showed up that were one-star reviews, and many of them said verified purchase. Have you ever thought of asking Amazon how many people within a few hours of posting those reviews returned their purchases? Because I just think that would be a really interesting stat to find out.
Well, thank you. And we'll take one more question to pair it up, and then we'll end.
To echo Renee's phrase, it's incredibly difficult to come to terms with the problem of anthropogenic climate change. My difficulty is after studying the problem and seeing the mounting dramatic effects, how it becomes harder to rationally sustain to prevent permanent cataclysmic changes. Do you think that one can learn too much about the problem that then paralyzes us to try to work towards solutions?
So let's take the first question. Mike Mann, people trashing you on Amazon.
Well, as you may know, Jeff Bezos, the founder and president of CEO of Amazon, also now owns the Washington Post. So maybe my friend Tom Tolles can help arrange a meeting with him. There was a video that was went semi-viral a few years ago, and it was a conservative who was explaining to fellow conservatives how to go online and target Amazon books, target books, progressive books that they don't like, how to bombard them with one-star reviews to lower their ratings, and how to similarly help along conservative authors by giving them lots of five-star ratings. Ultimately, you can't be worrying too much about these things. As it turns out, the cavalry did ultimately show up, and a number of really thoughtful reviews were sort of posted, and the rating of the book increased quite a bit. But to everybody in this audience, if you read any of my books, please do go online on Amazon and rate them. We can help sort of combat this bad faith attack on authors. But ultimately, I think it is a manifestation of the fact that there is this very fractious and very in just caustic atmosphere when it comes to issues like human-caused climate change. And some of it, I think, relates to the psychological factors that Renee is talking about. Some of it relates to the fact that the issue has been politicized by those who recognize that by politicizing this issue and by making it a partisan political issue, they could prevent any progress from being made on actually tackling the problem. And I think these sorts of attacks that we see online are a manifestation of a much larger problem, a problem in sort of the loss of good faith in our public discourse.
Renee Lertzman, the previous question was, is it possible to know too much that you become paralyzed?
That's a really powerful question to ask. And my response is no, but we have to be exceptionally mindful of the context in which we're learning and taking in the information. So when we're on our own and we're isolated and we're dealing with all of this, of course it's overwhelming and of course it is paralyzing potentially. But when we look at the context of being with others and being able to process what we're learning, things rapidly change. We actually, as humans, have incredible capacity to become very creative and have ingenuity, but we need to think about the context in which we're coming to terms with the issues.
Before we end, I want to ask you to just listen for a moment. The children outside are not in this room. They're joyful, they're happy. I just wanted to take that moment. It's been a little bit of a distraction, but it's actually poignant that that's what we're talking about here. Listen to those kids. Secondly, I'd like to invite you to give the round of applause for the Climate One crew who's in here, who does a great job. We have to end it there. We've been talking about climate denial and the hope for addressing climate change with Tom Towles, editorial cartoonist for The Washington Post. Christine Russell is a veteran science journalist and a fellow at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. Michael Mann is a professor at Penn State University and author with Tom Towles of The Madhouse Effect, how, I forget the subtitle, but how climate change is messing up everything. Climate denial is messing up everything. And Renee Lertzman, who's a psychologist and climate strategist. I'm Greg Dalton. I'd like to invite you to join the conversation on Twitter using our handle @ClimateOne. I'd like to thank our audience here at the Commonwealth Club and on podcasts and online. Thank you all for being part of this conversation today.